The 7 News I-Team has investigated the safety of America's generic drug supply for 2 years now, interviewing whistleblowers, scientists, former FDA inspectors, and patients who say the system is failing. Now, instead of backing away from its position, our senior investigator Lisa Fletcher discovered the FDA is doubling down. In a series of newly published web pages, the agency again insists generic drugs meet the same quality and safety standards as brand name medicines. This comes as Congress prepares legislation built around the idea that is simply not true.
If every generic drug truly met the same rigorous standards, why would Congress need legislation requiring the Department of Defense to buy only drugs independently identified as low risk? That question sits at the center of a new bipartisan bill from Representatives Rosa DeLauro and Rich McCormick.
I've said this wherever an FDA is, they are slow to deal with these issues. They should not be. Oftentimes just wonder if they really want to regulate, but that is their function and their job.
The legislation builds on a pilot program launched by Congress that has already exposed serious problems, from cancer-causing contaminants to improperly made medicines, many of which are made overseas in India. The premise is simple. Instead of assuming every generic drug is equally safe, identify drug quality worst to best and reward those at the top with federal purchasing contracts, starting with the U.S. military.
We want to make sure that whatever purchase there is on a generic drug that they're taking is not going to put them in harm's way.
But in a newly published response that appears to directly address growing criticism of the agency's oversight, the FDA insists that generic drugs must meet the same rigorous quality standards as brand drugs in dosage form, safety, strength, quality, and performance characteristics.
The FDA has now doubled down, publicly telling Americans that generic drugs meet the same quality standards. Is that scientifically supportable?
No, not at all.
Dr. Arthur Kellerman, a longtime emergency physician and co-author of a landmark New England Journal of Medicine article on generic drug quality, doesn't hesitate.
If the FDA cannot independently verify the quality and safety of generic drugs, should it continue to tell the American public that all generic drugs are equal to brands?
Absolutely not. We have to test product. And the FDA continues to this day to rely on factory inspections, even when they admit to Congress that they may be 5 or 6 or 7 years between visits. They continue to rely on paperwork submitted to them from the other side of the world without any way of independently validating that what's on those papers is correct. That's not good enough.
The FDA's website suggests that the criticisms are simply anecdotes and public concerns that omit important context about the agency's oversight.
The Office of Generic Drugs is calling objective problems anecdotal.
Right.
What was your response when you saw that word?
I was appalled. I really was. I just thought that was more than disingenuous. That was offensive. You're looking at congressional committees, investigative journalists, scientists, patients. Yeah, it was anecdotes and, et cetera.
Lisa Fletcher joining me now. Lisa, big question here. What does the FDA have to say about this?
Well, we asked the head of the FDA's Office of Generic Drugs, who authored that webpage, to explain why she seemed to dismiss the evidence from independent scientists, congressional investigators, outside labs, and even the FDA's own inspectors. She declined our interview and asked that we submit questions to her in writing. We did that. They agreed to answer the questions, but then they told us they couldn't meet our deadline. So if they provide answers, we're going to, of course, Josh, let you know.
Yeah, I think you'll stay on top of that. So what's next here for the bill that would make quality a purchasing criteria when DoD buys drugs for the military here?
Right. Well, the first hurdle has been cleared.
Yeah.
It was added to the House version of the National Defense Authorization Act, and now it's headed to the Senate for consideration there. The Senate will pass its own bill, and then conference negotiations will follow. I just spoke to DeLauro's office this afternoon, and they told me that this is a top priority to make sure that it stays included in the final NDAA.
All right, Lisa, I know you'll stay on top of the FDA for sure. And you can scan the QR code right there on the screen to see all of Lisa's investigations into generic drugs, including a whole half-hour documentary. You can find her years of coverage on this on our website, WJLA.com. Lisa, thank you.